This is a program that's been a long time in being developed, and I want to use this opportunity to acknowledge the enormous amount of work those who've been planning the program have done. The program overall has been chaired by David Draper, who's counsel with the Advocacy Resource Center for the Handicapped, and many of you will know David, and I'll be turning the matter over to him in the next minute or so. Secondly, the other persons, and their names are in the front of your book, but I would like to acknowledge their existence and their role. The other program chairs were Janice Blackburn, who's Assistant Director of the Psychiatric Hospitals Branch of the Ministry of Health. Actually, Janice has just changed jobs. That's the new one. Okay. David Giuffrida, who's Legal Counsel with the Psychiatric Patient Advocate Office of Ontario. Susan Himmel, who's the Deputy Official Guardian. Bob Holden, who's the Director of the Ontario Legal Aid Plan. And Beverly Reid, who's a lawyer in southwestern Ontario. And also, not on the one list, but she's on your other one, is Carla McCaig, who's a senior litigation lawyer also with Arch. There are also today Earl Atnikoff from Ottawa and Jim Brown from London are here, who are chairing the programs that are going to be offered in those cities as well. As I say, they've done an enormous amount of work, including work to develop a model fact situation, to develop a videotape that you're going to see later of a model review board hearing. And I think that work will pay off in the program you're going to see today. I would also like to thank Clio and the Law Union, who graciously allowed us to use their materials that you have, that we've added to with other material, but they have allowed us to make use of the materials at a cost to us that's much less than it would otherwise be, and I would really like to thank them for that help for the program. So with no further ado, I will turn the program now over to David Draper.
Thank you, George. I just really briefly want to let you know what's happening and make sure you have the material that you need. There's a paper that you should have picked up, a white paper that has handwritten at the top a group number. Please take a look at that and try and remember which group you're in if you plan to lose the paper. The groups relate to the workshops that will be run this afternoon. We'll be dividing up into 10 different workshops. The big package of material is meant to be an insert into the binder. And at the front of that, you'll see that the agenda for today is set out. Very briefly, the day is roughly divided into two. This morning, we're going to be trying to provide a fair amount of information to go through the Mental Health Act and deal with what's there and what the issues are in the field. This afternoon is going to be devoted to the fact situation that you'll find just after the first yellow sheet in that package. Now, at some point before this afternoon, I'd ask that you try and read through the fact situation, because the entire afternoon will be based on those facts. It's meant to be kind of taking you all from the beginning of a case right through the review board hearing. So try and take a read through that sometime this morning or over lunch. After that, there are issues that are set out for the workshop. You might want to read through those and give them a bit of thought before the workshops. And as I say, in the afternoon, we'll divide into the 10 workshops. If you don't have a workshop number, pick up a sheet outside and follow whatever number is on the sheet. You should also have gotten a copy, current consolidation of the Mental Health Act, a number of loose handouts, a blue sheet, a pink sheet, and a yellow sheet. Those will be used in the panels this morning. Okay, you'll be referred to those, and then the large materials you should have gotten as well, and that's the big binder. Okay, I don't want to take any more time away from this morning's panel. I will turn it over to David Giuffrida.
Good morning and welcome. Delighted to see the number of you here despite our subway difficulties, given the the longstanding and continuing need for a specialized mental health bar to provide service to those psychiatric patients in need of advocacy, particularly in the mental health review boards across Ontario. A good part of the day is devoted to technical materials, a detailed investigation of the Mental Health Act in the context of a particular fact situation in the afternoon. What we wanted to accomplish this morning was to situate it in the context in which you will find yourself delivering advocacy services, the real world of providing healthcare services to people labeled mentally ill, and the perspective of someone who has been a consumer of those services as well. I suppose just statistically the primary service you will be providing is to represent patients at review boards who have been civilly committed because of the volume of review board hearings conducted in a year. By far the majority of them regard issues of civil commitment, and some lesser figure regard issues of, for example, treatment incompetence, financial incompetence, access to clinical records. In the 10 provincial psychiatric hospitals, for example, there were in the 87-88 year something over 11,000 admissions, and perhaps about 5,000 of those admissions were of certified psychiatric patients. During the admission of 5,000 of those patients, they were civilly committed, and about a quarter of those decided to apply for the review board to review their status. There are 10 government-owned and operated provincial psychiatric hospitals. Rights advisors in those hospitals are members of the Psychiatric Patient Advocate Office. But in the other 68 Schedule I psychiatric facilities, psychiatric wards of general hospitals, and the 4 psychiatric hospitals that are non-government, the Clark, Sudbury Algoma, Royal Ottawa Hospital, and Homewood, there are something like 40,000 admissions in a year to the psychiatric units. A much smaller percentage of those are civilly committed, but there still may be several thousand in a year who are civilly committed, who will be needing rights advice provided by yourselves, and some percentage of those will apply to the review board. What I'd like to do this morning is introduce, in turn, 2 speakers who can speak to you about what it is like to firstly, to provide healthcare services in this context, and to be a consumer of healthcare services, and to be someone in the political environment responding to concerns about patients' rights in this context. Our first speaker is Dr. Samuel Malcolmson, a graduate of University of Toronto. He's had previous positions at the Clark Institute of Psychiatry and the Family Court Clinic, where he dealt with matters related to young offenders, child welfare, and custody and access. He was the director of mental health for Prince Edward Island from 1978 to 1981. He currently holds an academic rank of associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. For the last 7 years, Dr. Malcolmson has been psychiatrist-in-chief and clinical director at Queen Street Mental Health Centre. That is the largest psychiatric facility in Ontario with some 600 beds. The fact that Dr. Malcolmson has been in that position for the last 7 years means that he was there when the Psychiatric Patient Advocate Program, placing advocates in each of the 10 psychiatric hospitals, began in 1983. Meant that he was there in 1986 when the Rights Advisor Program began. He was there during 2 rounds of amendments to the Mental Health Act, which significantly increased safeguards for patients and swelled the number of forms to 45 that he and his medical staff had to deal with. He was there when someone decided to look for valet parking in the middle of his hospital by driving down the corridor and taking out 3 doors. Sam has seen a lot, and his humor, composure, and calm in the midst of it all is something perhaps the secret of which he'll share with us this morning when he talks about operating in this context. Sam?
Thank you very much. This low burn I've got in my face has got nothing to do with skiing in Quebec last year. It has to do with all the things that David referred to that I've gone through the last time. And indeed, being Presbyterian, it all feels quite natural. Now, let me explain what my position is. I'm the psychiatrist-in-chief. I'm essentially, for part of the medical staff are concerned, I'm an administrator. I don't have the luxury of standing in the back of the medical staff meetings railing against the latest stupid bit of legislation the dumb government has introduced. So that although I can't give you the lunatic fringe out of my heart. What I'm going to do, being a good government employee, is be unpolitical, quite honest, and I'm going to try to give you an idea of the culture you're going to run into. Now, in saying that, please be aware that some of the reactions and some of the experiences you're going to have are not going to be politically correct, enlightened, or particularly admirable. But there is a difference between discussing the issues at meetings like this or swirling your brandy in front of the logs in your fireplace and talking about mental health legislation. There's a difference in that and being in the front line in a hospital with very difficult, worrying patients. So this is what I'm trying to do, is convey the attitudes, correct and incorrect, that some of you will encounter. The new legislation, I think, generally was viewed quite positively. It certainly allowed us as an institution to escape the accusation that one of the early patient advocates made in the Globe and Mail, that the mental hospital was the last area where civil rights and individual rights were abused. I think that was a help for us. I think most of us felt it was a very positive step that no treatment should be given against the wishes of a competent patient. I think quite wrong to give treatment against a competent patient. That was a positive view. I think the easier access of patients to their own records and their ability to request changes in those records is a very healthy thing. The ability, and again, as far as the medical point of view, the ability for the medical staff to make representation to the Psychiatric Review Board in the situation where an involuntary, incompetent patient's relatives said no to treatment. Again, I think that was quite workable. So all these things were, in my view anyway, relatively positive dimensions of the legislative changes. So why is there not a groundswell of enthusiasm on the wards and in the psychiatric wards and mental institutions? I think that one of the difficulties is that the review board process, the advocacy issues, are at best viewed as rather unnecessary, and some people take it as rather a bit of a professional affront to them, that the government would need to provide legislation to, in effect, watchdogs the professional behavior of the psychiatrists. And at worst, as a mechanism for lawyers to make a reasonable living by interfering with treatment that is clearly wished and needed by the patient and seen that way by the psychiatrist and the patient's family. Now, in trying to understand where those attitudes come about, I think, as David mentioned, the patient advocate program preceded this legislation, and it was fairly contentious. Queen Street was very positive about the patient advocate program. I think, frankly, led by me. I think it's a very healthy program. I think that any large institution runs the risk of serving the staff and the needs of the institution, and the person that's there to serve is always not forefront in people's minds. So I think it's been a very healthy and positive program. It didn't start that way. It started with the view that the only thing that was wrong with patient care was doctors, medicines, and the institution. So we were kind of surprised and a bit disappointed. We hoped that there was going to be something said about the need for housing, the need for aftercare services, the need for adequate financial support for patients. But things have moved along since then, but some of the flavor of those bad early days have remained, and I'm sure that in your profession you have people who never let go of the bad old stories. They just tell them again, and then they tell them again, and then they tell them again, as if they've all happened yesterday, and they haven't. They're 5 years ago. Some old chestnut they heard in the coffee shop that suddenly becomes their experience. So this is always a problem, this anti-feeling that is difficult to deal with. You can understand also if you're on the ward and no matter how neutral and pure the rights advisor is, a patient goes into an office with a rights advisor quite content with the decision of the psychiatrist and the ward staff, and emerges from the office saying they intend to take the psychiatrist to court and challenge that position. They take an attitude which in some cases is very unpleasant. They can advise other patients to discontinue their medication, to appeal the decisions. So no matter how well principled, in fact, how well run, how well selected. If there is a degree of apprehension or suspicion in the culture of the ward, very, very difficult for the rights advisor and the advocates to be seen as neutral individuals, to be seen as constructive and helpful individuals. Even if you can conceptualize that in your mind, if a person changes, once was on your side and is now against you, you look around for the person who seems to have turned that person against you. It's probably stretching it a bit, but it would be a bit like having a legal advisor outside your office, and as your client leaves, they say, "Over here, me bye, and what did he tell you to do? Oh, well, are you sure that's the right thing?" The other analogy would be to have all your clients milling about the front of your office, the ones who think you're terrible and the ones who think you ain't all bad, and the ones who are going to sue you and the ones who think, well, you're a reasonable fellow. But they're there all the time. They never go away, and the ones who think you're pretty awful have the potential of contaminating those who think you're reasonable. Think about that, me bias. I want to talk a little bit about the ward, because you're going to go on the wards. You're going to interview patients there. You're going to come and say to the head nurse, "I'm so-and-so, and may I speak to such and such?" And I hope that you're received in a civilized and polite and professional way. Be assured that the people and the doctors and nurses who give you a bad time give me a bad time, and they give administration a bad time. And I don't know whether they give their children a bad time or their dogs and cats a bad time, but there are people, at least in medicine, maybe it's only restricted medicine, who are against things. And just cheer yourself up. If they're giving you a rough ride, they've been giving me a rough ride too. But please understand that what's different about the way, the role and framework of a psychiatrist in the mental hospitals is that they're there in the front line virtually all day. Unlike a surgeon, they don't visit and go back to their office. So they're part of this culture endlessly. And they pick up any of the negative consequences of patients' attitudes if they're stirred up. So it's nice to talk about these things from a distance. It's not as nice to experience it hour after hour. I think it's an important distinction is in the general hospital units, you're going to find that often the psychiatrist has an ongoing relationship with his patients, so that there will be fewer challenges and the atmosphere will be more therapeutic. It's fair to say that in Queen Street, where the most ill and most disadvantaged patients are, that patient characteristic is complicated by the fact that about a quarter of our admissions are brought by police, and about 40% are admitted on a Form 1, which is the form for compulsory psychiatric evaluation. So they don't come in as positive, willing people looking for treatment. They've sometimes been picked up and brought to the hospital for some dust-up in a restaurant or a boarding home. So that certainly infects the attitude. Intellectually, people understand that the patient's rights must be respected. It's difficult sometimes to deal with families who are just astounded that someone who needs treatment, clearly needs treatment, when psychotic is dangerous, when under treatment is not psychotic and not dangerous, they are astounded at the limitations of the psychiatrist, so that we are endlessly criticized by families. I can tell you from my personal experience being at inquests once in a while, we have a hard time, the coroner and myself as an expert witness have a hard time having coroners, juries understand this. They say, "What? Do this again, doctor. You mean, you know this person needs treatment and they have a mental illness, and so you can't treat them?" Well, that's right. So that we're on side with this for the most part, but I can assure you that families and the public in general are astounded. Why did these changes come about? They came about because in the bad old days, and I hope the bad old days, there was without any question there were abuses, without any question. Politicians listened to compelling, accurate, and true stories of things that should not have happened, but they happened. So it really no surprise that regrettably our profession and this area is under the scrutiny that it is. Things happen that shouldn't have happened. So the stories are honest and they're compelling. And where this pendulum will end up is another story. But again, understanding that process is different from dealing with it day to day. Let me talk a little bit about review boards, just to finish up. The problem with the review boards is that they become a focus for the frustration of much of the medical staff. They're mad at me for demanding more and more paperwork, higher quality of care. They're a focus for their negative feelings about hospital administration, the government, pay, working conditions, etc. So that this whole area, which should be constructive and relatively neutral, becomes the focus of a lot of other issues that upset people and annoy people. And again, the bad old stories get told again and again. It is true that a council in Western Ontario took the direction from his patient. The patient wanted out of the hospital, told the patient not to talk to anybody. Do not talk to anybody, not to your psychiatrist, not to staff. Because obviously in talking to staff, then the patient ran the risk of having his suicidal ideation recorded and, quote, used against him. Well, you see, those kind of stories don't go over well. Recently, the Globe reported that when one of our patients made an appeal to the divisional court, because he was psychotic and dangerous and without treatment, because, of course, as soon as their appeal, treatment is suspended, he remained in a seclusion room in a cell for 9 months, awaiting that appeal. 9 months. Now, we can't put that together with the principles of the new legislation. We can't put that together. But we can't control it either. Now, the obligation for the hospital is to try to make sure the mechanics of your visiting us and getting access to the case books runs as smoothly as possible. Most hospitals have a single individual, a single contact person, because it's very difficult to access these large institutions. But our obligation is to make that run as smoothly as possible. If it's not, phone someone at the top and make sure it does. The decisions are very quick and rapid from the review board. They're not once an appeal is made. The central thing I want to leave you with is I think there is a very justifiable concern about the review board process from the psychiatrist's point of view. That is that the process essentially is anti-therapeutic. The psychiatrist feels he must make the case against his patient in order to counter the case made by the patient's lawyer for the patient. That casts us in the role of a crown, of the accuser. And in doing so, we have to use information that is quite personal, private, in front of a group of strangers. Understandably, patients get very upset about that, not all, but a significant number. So following the hearing, the psychiatrist is expecting to return to the ward and continue a therapeutic relationship with his patient. For that reason, as a political organization, the Ontario Psychiatric Association wants a psychiatrist out of the role of prosecutor and making the case against a patient, but rather be there for the review board as a third-party witness, in effect. But this dimension, which I understand is necessary, is extremely unpalatable from a dynamic and therapeutic point of view. You're comfortable in these proceedings. Some doctors are not. They're apprehensive. They're timid. Other of them are a bit arrogant, and they take affront. I think it's a minimal obligation that a physician should be able to explain in the Queen's English what he's doing and why. But that doesn't come easily to some people. But understand, some of them I know are good doctors, but they're not great at review boards. You just need to know that. We're working on it. But in the adult learning model, if you're negatively disposed to something, it's hard to take new information in. I hope this has been helpful. It's a true story, and I hope your experience with us is as civilized as it can be, but it won't always be. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam. if we didn't have to accomplish so much in one day, I'm sure we could all profit by spending much more time listening to your observations about being a provider in the system. Equally, I think we'll regret the short amount of time that we have in the balance of the morning to hear from David Reville, MPP for Riverdale. David has had an illustrious career. He started out more than 24 years ago as a reluctant guest of Her Majesty and has moved on now to be part of her loyal opposition. He's chronicled his first experience I described as a contributor to the book Shrink Resistant, The Struggle Against Psychiatry in Canada. Hasn't written his memoirs about being an MPP because that story continues. And he certainly wasn't idle in the period in between. In 1972, he founded Neighborhood Legal Services and has continued to have a deep commitment to housing issues and issues of health. He became an alderman for Ward 7 from 1980 and only left it in 85 to successfully run with the New Democratic Party for MPP. His post-secondary education is quite a blend of English, history, law, plumbing, and gas fitting, which stood him in good stead in the business he began in 1973, in contracting business and plumbing. And on some other occasion, I hope will share with us how all these disciplines interrelate in some intellectual seamless web. He was also a central figure in the legislature during the amendments to the Mental Health Act, initially in Bill 7 and more particularly in Bill 190. And it was quite a rare luxury to have someone in the legislature who not only was deeply committed to these issues but had a keen understanding and personal awareness of them as well, because as the results are displayed in the blue-covered book before you, they're fairly complex amendments and some fairly subtle ends were sought to be achieved in them. And David was significantly involved in that. He can speak to you today from the perspective of a lawmaker in the mental health area, a consumer, as someone who responds to constituents, both families of psychiatric patients and consumers themselves with concerns about health care, mental health care in Ontario. David?
Give me my book back.
All right.
As a teaching aid. Thank you, David. And it's encouraging for me to see so many advocates and would-be advocates here today. I was very cunning and sought to speak after Dr. Malcolmson, and now I've outsmarted myself because, of course, he gave a very balanced presentation, as he always does, and being calm and urbane and good-natured and healthy-looking. We would not expect anything less. I, too, would like to speak for a few minutes about the culture that you will be working in or already work in. And I, in fact, would want to speak less as a legislator and more as a consumer of mental health services and an advocate on behalf of people in the system, and not just the recipients of the service, but the providers of the service as well, although that is not always as easily apparent from my public statements. I think that it is difficult to be apolitical about health. And although Sam would say that he was being unpolitical in his remarks, I think he meant that he was trying to be balanced and not, in fact, advance the position that a caregiver would hold and must protect and advance in order to deliver the care that the caregiver thinks is appropriate. And I think he did that quite successfully. But as in my work as a health critic, it is clear that these questions are political, and it relates to who gets what and how much of it do they get, and who gets to give it and who doesn't get to give it. And the whole exercise of the health professions legislative review is about those kinds of issues of money and power and status and consumer protection and rights. And I think that mental health is even more political than health in general. And I think that that is because society has created a rather unusual set of conditions under which a person may be deprived of their liberty, may be injected, medicated, shocked, restrained, and I'm happy to say all of those things under conditions that are much more carefully controlled today than they were once. Even aside from those kinds of intrusions, which you lawyers remember can be described as assault under some kinds of conditions, there is a definite power imbalance between the caregiver and the care receiver in these situations. Not only because of the physical location of where the services are delivered, but also because of the potential power over the person that the caregiver has. And in fact, in my own experience, which is becoming rapidly an old chestnut, and it was in the 60s before many of the current protections were in place, and while the ideology of mental health was continuing to evolve, but notwithstanding those fairly major caveats, it was clear that virtually every aspect of the, quote, life I was living on the locked ward where I was controlled at some level by the physician in charge of the hospital in which I was, but in very real terms by the ward supervisor and the ward staff. And some of you will be familiar with the detail of how patients are sort of graded in hospital, and it relates quite properly to the some notion of the level of responsibility they can handle and how well they are, how appropriate they are, and how well connected to reality they are. And to a very large extent, those determinations were based on the observations of the ward staff. And if you wanted to graduate from your pajamas to your clothes, then that would require a favorable report written in the little book about what you had been up to most recently. So that if, quite naturally, you were irritated by something that happened on the ward and you remarked on that, then that might be construed as some kind of inappropriate behavior, and you'd stay in your jammies, and you wouldn't get to wear your clothes. These kinds of deprivations tend to weigh on you quite heavily when you haven't got much else to do, and may contribute to the interests of some patients in spending most of their time litigating and not much time being a partner in their therapy. There is no question that some of us become enamored with our problem and not very much interested in a solution to our problem, and I suspect that those of you who are active in this field will have encountered some people who are like that. The bigger question, of course, and it's an important question and it's a difficult question, is on the one hand we have the best interests of the patient, and on the other hand we have patient autonomy, and that in fact is the locus of the debate, and probably Sam would agree with me that the pendulum has swung recently somewhat more towards patient autonomy than it had been in the past. I believe that that is a good thing, but I don't think that it is progress that has come without creating a number of difficult problems to solve. And those problems sometimes are procedural. Those problems sometimes relate to the different cultures of the professionals involved, and Sam has described that as well, that physicians are primarily interested in care, and lawyers are much more interested in rights. And there is an inevitable tension between those interests, and it seems to me that it is necessary to grapple with that tension and to continue to grapple with it. And we will be doing just that because, of course, the exercise that's going on now up the street there, well, I presume it's up the street, is an examination of the question of competency, which is one of the three great issues in this field after committal and between consent. And those are interesting theoretical problems, but they are also very difficult practical problems to resolve. What the resolution of the discussion of competency will be is hard to say. Obviously, it depends on your point of view as to what hopes you might have for an outcome in that regard. But there's no question that the parents and the families and the friends of a person who appears to be in severe distress and is behaving in a scary kind of way, and as a politician, well, all politicians certainly hear from their constituents about their despair over the difficulty of getting timely care for their son Billy, or their wife, or their husband, or their uncle. And many of the people in the families and friends sector of this framework find the Mental Health Act incomprehensible. They cannot believe that there would be a barrier to someone they love getting the care that they need. Every now and then when I'm feeling particularly masochistic, I go and speak to families and friends group. The best known organized group is called the Friends of Schizophrenics, and they have a national, provincial, and branch organization. They are getting stronger, I believe. In many ways, I believe that that's a good thing. I think there is no question that the families and friends of people who suffer from mental distress are key stakeholders in this system and have not had adequate input into the design of programs and the delivery of programs. However, the tendency among families and friends groups is to take a much more restrictive view of how mental health legislation should operate, and that flows from their very real, honest, compelling desperation about the situation of their loved ones, who often, in fact, abuse their families. I don't think there's any other way to describe it, quite profoundly. Sort of smashing all the windows at 4 in the morning is not the sort of behavior you would want from your 40-year-old son. And, as lawyers have their horror stories, psychiatrists have their horror stories, politicians also have their horror stories. And I don't know of a politician who has not heard from a distraught constituent who is seeking help for a relative, and who believes that it's the Mental Health Act that is the barrier to that help being delivered. So that is clearly part of the context in which mental health advocates work, And there is sometimes no magic recipe for resolving the different interests of the parties involved. And fortunately for an advocate, you know who your client is. But I suspect also advocates are always aware that they're citizens of the world as well as representatives of a client, and we'll have to try and resolve these issues. We don't really have, I would have been really pleased if we'd had enough time to do some Q&A, because I think sometimes that's much more useful than having a couple of guys or whatever standing up and blathering away. I do want to finish my little section by doing a commercial, however. Buy this book. This book is, David has already referred to it. It is called Shrink Resistant. It's available here in Toronto by New Star Books, a lefty publisher out of Vancouver. It is a collection of chestnuts, some old and some new. Basically, it's a series of survivors' tales written by people who didn't much like their experience in the mental health system. It is very definitely a political document. The bias of the authors is quite clear. Talk a lot about rights and the feeling that their rights were abused. The foreword was written by Carla McCaig, who you will hear from later today. There's a nice little section in this book by me, and if you all buy this book, maybe we'll get some royalties. Thank you very much.